Oh, right. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, gang. So welcome to the luxurious Chateau Patnos. Again, having a couple of technical difficulties that should hopefully be fixed shortly. It's a pandemic. Things happen, right? All right. So what we are going to be talking about today will be do to do. Let me try that again. Do to do Jewish terrorism. But before we get to there we are. Let's look at where we are in the semester. So we are currently entering week 10, that is between the 2nd and the 6th of November. So again, your discussion 3 is up and ready. Again, what I would recommend, I said this in the email, but what I would recommend is before you post what you like a response to a question or anything, just look to see what other people have written to see if you're talking about something similar to what they're talking about, and that's okay. But just add on, like reply to their post more so than creating your own post, because I've seen several times where somebody will post one thing and then 2 hours later somebody will post something exceedingly similar, almost talking to what the other person was talking about, but not talking to the person. So that's just my advice. Hint, hint, nudge, nudge, wink, wink. So we're in week 10, which means in 2 weeks, that is 2 weeks from Thursday, the 20th of November, your Batman and Terrorism assignment is due. This should be no more than 4 pages, I believe I said. Hopefully, you'll take some time to watch The Dark Knight, I don't know, over fall break. Watch it once for fun and then watch it for the assignment. Have the assignment up and sort of try and take some notes. See if you can pick out key scenes that you could use to support your ideas, stuff like that. Which means next week, week 11, the 9th to the 13th, is fall break. Yay! So you have my permission to take at least 2 days off. Take 2 days out of the week we have off and just relax. I mean, there's been a lot going on. You guys are working your butts off. You've earned a break. You deserve a break today. So we'll get through that. Week 12, week 13, and week 14. That's when we're going to go back full bore. Right now, I'm thinking of not doing a video for week 15 because it's only one day. I'm at this point, I will send an email out with confirmation. But at this point, I'm probably just going to give you guys a day to work on your research paper, because the research paper is due on the 7th. So I'm leaning right now to just giving you that whole Monday to just work on your research paper. I'll send out an email week 13 to confirm. And I've also decided that I am going to give a more full study guide for the final exam. I will send that out on the 7th of December as well. All right, so that's what we got coming up. So let us get this party started. Let's get it started hot. Let's get it started in here. All right, so as always, we start with the key terms. Key terms and hard words. Again, these are potential terms that could appear on the final exam. With respect to the identifications, I'm not going to have you guys identify terms from prior to the exam, at least for the identification section. You may want to go back and look at your midterm exam. You may want to look back at the midterm terms when it comes to the comprehensive question to see what fits in. So this is what we're going to be talking about in this video. We're going to talk about Jewish or Zionist terrorism. We're going to look at the Haganah, we're going to look at the Irgun, and then we're going to look at Lehi, that is the Stern Gang. Now, while the Haganah is not a Jewish terrorist group per se, the two main groups that we're going to be talking about with respect to Jewish or Zionist terror, that is the Irgun and Lehi, they will branch off from the Haganah. And so what we can see with this Jewish terrorism that we're going to be talking about today is an amalgamation of second wave terrorism, that is nationalist terrorism, as well as fourth wave terrorism, that is religious terrorism, as they are focused on gaining a Jewish homeland. And so let's talk about the origins of the Haganah. And so while you do have the formation of small self-defense organizations in the Jewish communities that were formed during the various aliyahs, the various waves of Jewish immigration to Palestine that we've talked about. When the Jewish people arrived in these waves of immigration, they did set up small self-defense organizations. The main forerunner, however, to the Haganah would be the Jewish Legion. That's this group right here. The Jewish Legion will be the forerunner to the Haganah. And this Jewish Legion fought for the British during the First World War. Now, the Jewish Legion was formed by Zev Jabotinsky. There he is right there. Zev, Z-E-V, Jabotinsky. The man, the myth, the legend on the left. Jabotinsky was a Russian Jewish immigrant to Britain. That is, he was born in Russia, he was Jewish, and he immigrated to Britain. The Jewish Legion was a 5,000-man strong unit who fought for the British in the Ottoman campaign. So they fought for the British in the basically the Middle East. We're talking Mesopotamia, that is Iraq, as well as in the eastern coast of the Mediterranean. And they fought for the British in 1917, 1918. Jabotinsky himself was a member of the World Zionist Organization. And this was the organization that included Theodore Herzl and Chaim Weizmann as leaders, and was therefore informed about the politics happening in Britain, particularly regarding the recognition of a Jewish homeland in Palestine. So he understood that there were negotiations, there was discussions between the World Zionist Organization and British leaders in trying to push for what will become the Balfour Declaration. Now, Jabotinsky, as I mentioned, formed the Jewish Legion. And his goal of forming the Jewish Legion was twofold. He had two reasons for forming it. First, he wanted the Jewish people to fight for Palestine so that the World Zionist Organization and other Jewish leadership could argue that the Jewish people had fought and died for a British Palestine. And therefore, it would give more credence, it would give more weight to the Balfour Declaration that was currently being negotiated and was forthcoming. So he wanted the Jewish Legion to fight for, and I mean, this is war, die for a British Palestine, which ideally would come to the Jews. So the idea was that the World Zionist Organization could argue that Jewish blood had been spilled for the creation of a British Palestine. Therefore, the Jewish people have the right to have this as their homeland. And then secondly, Jabotinsky wanted to create conditions on the ground that were conducive to the Jewish community by arming and training Jews who could potentially immigrate to Palestine after the war. Jabotinsky believed that the Jewish community would grow to be more self-sufficient and therefore less reliant on British protection. And so after the war, former members of the Jewish Legion will form the core of the Haganah. Now, what is the Haganah? So I've talked about the origins of it. I've talked about how they're if you use the Greek mythology analogy, the Haganah will fully formed out of the head of the Jewish Legion, just like Athena emerged fully formed from Zeus's head. So we talked about the origins of the Haganah, the Jewish Legion sort of forming the core of the Haganah. But let's talk more about what the Haganah is, what the Haganah was. The Haganah was a self-defense force for the Jewish communities formed during the various aliyahs, formed during the various waves of immigration. And during the first decade of the Palestinian Mandate. So the Palestinian Mandate, if you remember back, that was basically British-controlled Palestine. During the first decade of the Palestinian Mandate, so think the 1920s, the Haganah was an organization in name only. Each individual kibbutz, K-I-B-B-U-T-Z, a kibbutz is a communal farm. That's kind of the best way to describe it. Each individual kibbutz is in communal farms, and each individual town had their own little self-defense group. More like a combination of local law enforcement and cadets. They are there more to sort of keep the peace. This changes after the 1929 Palestinian riots. And I'll briefly explain what the 1929 Palestinian riots were. And what they were is it was violence in Jerusalem and Palestine overall. Because not for the first time, and certainly not for the last time, violence occurred over access to the Wailing Wall. Wailing, W-A-I-L-I-N-G, as in wailing, as in crying, the Wailing Wall. That is another term for the Western Wall. Now, for those of you not familiar, basically what ends up happening is we have the creation of the Jewish temple way back, way back, and it was destroyed during the period of Roman occupation. And so the Western Wall, or the Wailing Wall, is the remaining wall of the destroyed Jewish temple that is along the Temple Mount in Jerusalem. So we have a mountain, not like the Rocky Mountains, not like the Himalayas, but a Temple Mount where on the top the temple was created as well as destroyed. And the Western Wall, or the Wailing Wall, is the remaining wall of the Jewish temple. And this was a this is a place of religious significance to the Jews, and access to the Temple Mount is contentious between the Jews and Muslims. And so what ends up happening is between the 23rd and 29th of August 1929, you have a running series of riots throughout the Palestinian Mandate, with violence occurring on both sides. During this week of rioting, you have 133 Jews killed and 339 injured, and 110 Arabs killed, and an additional 232 Arabs injured. What this did for the what these riots did for the Jewish communities is it prompted a reorganization of the Haganah, shifting from a sort of police, a local law enforcement sort of cadet type organization to a proper military organization designed to protect Jewish neighborhoods and Jewish communities from this type of violence. It's a self-defense organization, but you could almost equate it to one of the religious militias created during the during the Troubles in Ireland. In Ireland, you had Protestant militias as well as Catholic militias designed to protect their neighborhoods. That's effectively, after the Palestinian riots, what happens with the Haganah. And so between 1929 until the end of the Second World War, the Haganah will advocate a policy of restraint. They will advocate a policy of restraint, focusing just on defending the Jewish community and not responding to Arab provocations or Arab attacks. That is, the Haganah said, we will not do any counterattacks to any Arab attacks. Now, this policy will lead to a division within the Haganah between the moderates, who followed this policy of restraint, and radicals who wanted a more proactive response to the British, a more proactive response to Arab officials. Now, here we have on the left an image, a photograph of Haganah training. They are armed with British weapons. This is a Sten, S-T-E-N, gun, a fast-firing automatic weapon. And here they are practicing, training to protect and this is on a kibbutz. We have the farm in the background. And the Haganah is interesting because not only in most militias that we talked about with respect to Ireland, for example, these would be primarily male organizations. We saw in Algeria, however, in the 1960s, how women became involved with respect to bombing of the French. The Haganah is different because from its start, it allowed women to be part of the self-defense organization. So on the right here, we have an image of a female squad of Haganah members practicing their shooting. So again, the Haganah followed a policy of restraint. They focused on just defending the community from attacks and not having any counterattacks, not responding to any Arab provocations. And I mentioned this policy will lead to a division in the Haganah between moderates who followed this policy of restraint and radicals who wanted a more proactive response to the British and to the Arab communities. And coming out of this division within the Haganah is going to be an organization we're going to shorten, we're going to just call the Irgun. And the Irgun was formed from the division within the Haganah, and they were formed in 1931. The Irgun believed that only active resistance against the Arabs, only active resistance against the British would achieve a Jewish state. Members of the Irgun believed that the Haganah were too reactive. The Irgun believed in active resistance. And so prior to the Second World War, so prior to 1939, the Irgun was focused primarily on retribution. Whenever a Jew was hurt or killed, the Irgun would retaliate against the Arab community. For example, on 6 March 1937, a Jewish man was shot while at prayers at the Wailing Wall in Jerusalem. See, I told you it wouldn't be the last time violence would occur as a part of the Wailing Wall. A Jewish man was shot while at prayers at the Wailing Wall in Jerusalem. Shortly thereafter, the Irgun targeted an Arab community in Jerusalem, shooting one man. The analogy I tend to use with respect to Irgun, and I mean, I'm not sure if any or many of you guys have seen this movie out here, but we have a movie called The Untouchables starring Kevin Costner and Sean Connery, in which he won his only Academy Award and who recently passed away at the age of 90. I mean, what a career. But Sean Connery, a Scottish man playing an Irish beat cop in Chicago in the 1920s. Now, in The Untouchables, Connery's character has a scene where he explains to Kevin Costner's Elliot Ness that you have to play by Chicago rules. And what are Chicago rules? Well, if he brings a knife, you bring a gun. If he puts one of your guys in the hospital, you put one of his guys in the morgue. So it's this idea of escalated retaliation. They bring a gun, they bring a knife, we bring a gun. They beat one of your guys up, put him in the hospital, we put one of them guys in the ground. That's the Irgun mentality. Escalated retaliation. Now, during the Second World War, between 1939 and 1945, as some of you have seen who have read The Bombing of the King David Hotel, legal and illegal Jewish immigration helped grow the Irgun as more and more military trained immigrants, such as Menachem Begin, joined the Irgun and change it into a more military organization. So it goes from less of a gang type mentality to more of a military unit, a guerrilla military unit. And so the Irgun starts growing as more legal and illegal Jewish immigrants who have military training find their way to Palestine, join the Irgun, and transform it into a more proper military organization. And at the end of the Second World War, the Irgun will focus its ire, focus its target on the British and away from the Arabs. Because the Irgun believed by this point, by 1945, the belief was amongst the various Jewish military organizations that they were strong enough to hold their own against the Arab community if only the British were out of Palestine. If the British were out, the Jewish military organizations, the Haganah and the Irgun, believed they were strong enough to deal with the Arabs in Palestine. And so there's going to be three major attacks by the Irgun against the British prior to 1948. 1948 is the end of the British Mandate. 1948 is when the British basically hold up their hands and go, screw you guys, I'm out of here. And the three major attacks are going to be the bombing of the King David Hotel, the Acre prison break on 4 May 1947, and the Sergeant's Affair in July 1947. We won't talk about the King David Hotel bombing as we've read about it. And if you haven't read it, if you did your written response on the on Hollywood and terrorism. Just give it a look over. It'll provide you with some good information regarding the Irgun, regarding the Haganah, regarding the Jewish terrorist organizations occurring during this period. But I do want to briefly look at the Acre prison break and the Sergeant's affair. So here we have the Irgun, Menachem Begin right there. And just like, I'm going to close my face here. And just like what we saw with respect to, say, the Phoenix Park killings, we have wanted posters for various members of the Irgun leadership. Again, Menachem Begin. There we go, Menachem Begin right there. All right. So let's talk about the Acre prison break, 4 May 1947. And on the left, we have an image of one of the gates towards the Acre prison. Now, between 1945 and 1947, British authorities, with some intelligence, with some help from the Haganah, started arresting members of the Irgun and started arresting members of Lehi. We'll talk about Lehi in a little bit. And so by early 1947, by early 1947, the main prison in Acre, that is located in northern Palestine, was holding 70 Jewish prisoners, along with your typical assortment of people who find themselves in prison. Now, the Irgun believed that the prison in Acre would be a solid political target to attack, as well as an opportunity to free their compatriots. And so members of the Irgun, they had several cells, CELLS, working together to try to plan this prison break. And so these members of the Irgun spent the better part of April 1947 planning the prison break, communicating with Jewish prisoners through a series of signals and a series of messages snuck into and out of the prison. Now, the hanging by the British hanging of 4 prominent Jewish prisoners on 19 April 1947 made the prison break more necessary, made Irgun go, okay, they're starting to kill prisoners in the prison. We have to move much more quickly. Now, during the planning phase, reconnaissance by the Irgun noticed that there was a Turkish bath house next to the southern wall of the prison. And that was a weak point. Now, the Turkish bathhouse by this point was not being used, but it was also not really being watched all that closely by prison officials. So the Irgun would spend the early part of May smuggling TNT, smuggling dynamite into the Turkish bath. And so on the 4th of May, on 4 May 1947, the Irgun enacted their plan. And so similar to what happened in the King David Hotel bombing, the Irgun set up mines, set up explosive traps designed to prevent pursuit and blocked off key avenues of approach to the Acre prison. At 16:22, at 4:22 p.m., the bomb exploded in the Turkish bathhouse, blowing a hole in the southern wall of the prison, and the Jewish prisoners ran out into the waiting Irgun trucks and jeeps. Into the waiting Irgun trucks and jeeps. At the same time this was happening, regular prisoners saw this escape attempt and decided, well, it's time, the time is right for me to get the hell out of the prison as well. And so the guards started shooting wildly into the crowd of prisoners before being chased away by grenades that members of the Irgun were starting to throw in their direction. 28 Jewish prisoners and 213 Arab prisoners successfully made their escape. However, 5 members of the prison break team were captured by the British, and 3 of them were sentenced to death for their involvement in the prison break. The other 2 were minors, and therefore they were exempt from the death penalty. There we go. So we have 5 members of the prison break team were captured by the British, 3 of which were sentenced to death for their involvement in the prison break. The other 2 were sentenced to, were minors and therefore exempt from the death penalty. Whoop. I should have gone back like that. Now, this prison break and the fact that these 5 individuals were captured and sentenced to death leads directly into the Sergeant's Affair, July 1947. Because as a result of the death penalty issued in the Acre prison break, the Irgun decided to kidnap 2 British soldiers in an attempt to trade the soldiers for the death row inmates. And this is a little ironic because as we go into the 1960s, 1970s, the state of Israel comes to a policy of no negotiations with terrorists, including ransoming, including kidnapping. Yet in July 1947, the Irgun, a Jewish organization that will be involved in the creation of Palestine, remember Menachem Begin will become a prime minister, they're going to kidnap 2 British soldiers to try to trade them for the Irgun prisoners being held by the British. And so the Irgun would follow around a couple of British sergeants. That's why it's called the Sergeant's Affair, who were part of an intelligence unit in a town in northern Palestine known as Netanya, Natanya. Netanya is located in northern Palestine, to determine their routine and to case them out for a potential kidnapping. And so on 11 July 1947, these 2, an Irgun squad assaulted these 2 British sergeants, Clifford Martin and Mervyn Pace. They assaulted these 2 British sergeants outside a cafe in Netanya and kidnapped them using chloroform to knock the 2 out. Now, in movies, chloroform acts like that. You put a rag and chloroform over the mouth and suddenly somebody goes, ah, and just goes unconscious. Mythbusters actually talked about chloroform, and it actually takes a while for somebody to get knocked out from chloroform, in part because it evaporates quickly, but also the size and the height and weight of a person it needs to be taken into account in how quickly the chloroform works. So, I mean, somebody could have a chloroform rag over the mouth, and it could take a minute, maybe even 2 minutes for them to pass out. So when you think about what's happening, it's not like, oh, they hold them down and chloroform them and then poof, they're out. It took a little while. So these 2 men, Clifford Martin and Mervyn Pace, were captured. They were held down and chloroformed, and it took them a while to be knocked out. Martin and Pace were then brought to the industrial section of Netanya, where they were kept in a prepared underground bunker area near a disused diamond processing plant. You might be going, gee, what that an industrial area? Well, that's probably well traveled. I mean, go to the industrial area in Regina, for example. I mean, you have large areas that hardly anybody go to. So it's a good place to sort of hide out. And so they developed a prepared underground bunker. And Martin and Pace, the two sergeants, were kept sealed underground with a supply of food, a supply of oxygen tanks, always helps to breathe, as well as instructions on how to refresh the air supply. And they were kept with a personal bucket. Because, I mean, think about it. What do people need to survive? Well, they need air. They have oxygen. They need food and water, which they were supplied. And what happens after you eat and drink? Well, I mean, it's a natural biological function. So they were supplied a bucket to do their business. The Irgun would check on Martin and Pace every couple of days, thankfully emptying the buckets, as well as resupplying them with food and oxygen. In response to the kidnapping of Martin and Pace, the British authorities in Netanya placed a curfew on the city and put it under martial law. Martial, M-A-R-T-I-A-L, as in military law, as they unsuccessfully searched for the kidnapped soldiers. The British, however, were resolved not to make the trade and set the execution date of the three Irgun prisoners for the 29th of July, 1947. And this is even after the Irgun reiterated, sent a message and said, look, you do this, and the hostages would be killed if you hang those three prisoners. And the British went through with it. On between 4 and 5 a.m. on the 29th of July, 1947, the three Irgun prisoners were hung in Acre Prison. And so the Irgun followed through. By 6 p.m. on the same day, the 29th of July, the Irgun hung both Martin and Pace. And in the early morning of the 30th of July, the Irgun moved the bodies from the underground bunker and hung them in a nearby eucalyptus grove with a note pinned to each body. The note said, quote, "Two British spies held in underground captivity since July 12 have been tried after the completion of the investigations of their, quote, criminal anti-Hebrew activities on the following charges." So basically what the Irgun are doing is basically saying, look, you did a phony charge for your prisoners, we're going to do a phony charge for our prisoners. So we've investigated and have been found guilty on the following charges. Illegal entry into the Hebrew homeland, basically arguing that the British illegally entered the Jewish homeland, with Jewish home state, which doesn't quite exist yet. They were charged with membership of a British criminal terrorist organization known as the Army of Occupation. Basically, the British are calling us terrorists, so we're going to call the British Army terrorists. British criminal organization known as the Army of Occupation, which was responsible for the torture, murder, deportation, and denying the Hebrew people the right to life. Basically, some of the same charges that members of the Irgun were charged with. They were charged with illegal possession of arms. And this is interesting because one of the ways that the British authorities arrested members of the Haganah, members of the Irgun, members of Lehi, was on illegal weapons possession charges. They were charged with anti-Jewish spying in civilian clothes, basically saying these guys weren't wearing uniforms, therefore they're acting against the rules of war. And then premeditated hostile designs against the underground. So those were the charges. The note further says, quote, found guilty of these charges, they have been sentenced to hang and their appeal for clemency dismissed. This is interesting. This is not a reprisal for the execution of the 3 Jews, but, quote, a routine judicial fact. So a note was pinned to each body. And in addition, the Irgun planted a mine beneath each body. And so the first body, the body of Sergeant Martin, was cut down. It fell directly on the mine, completely destroying Martin's body and wounding 2 nearby British soldiers. So that's the Irgun. Just a couple of examples of the actions that they undertook, particularly after the Second World War. The next group I want to talk about is Lehi, known as the Stern Gang. Now, the Stern Gang was formed, so I'll go back here. Actually, this works. So remember, we have the Haganah, basically kind of splitting up, kind of dividing, because you have people who are more moderate versus people who are more radical. Restraint versus active resistance. The active resistors turn into the Irgun. And so Lehi is going to be a splinter group from the Irgun, a splinter group that basically says, no, Irgun, you're not going far enough. And it was formed as a splinter group by Abraham Stern, S-T-E-R-N, hence the name the Stern Gang, formed in 1940. And as I said, Stern believed that the Irgun was not going far enough or acting fast enough against the British. Now, Lehi will never be a large group or large organization. It will never be more than 200 to 300 members strong, but still had an impact outside of its relatively small size. In particular, the Stern Gang focused in a similar way that the Irish Republican Brotherhood or the Irish National Invincibles in the 19th century acted and targeted British officials and perceived collaborators. The 2 major individuals assassinated by Lehi were Lord Moyne on 6 November 1944 and Count Folk Bernadotte. Folk Bernadotte, he's the Count of Visberg in 17 September 1948. Here we have on the left, this is Abraham Stern. And so first, let's talk about the assassination of Walter Guinness, also known as Lord Moyne, M-O-Y-N-E, on 6 November 1944. Now, Lord Moyne was the resident minister of the Middle East. His position in the British government was resident minister of the Middle East, and he held this position between 1942 until his death in 1944. What this meant, basically, was that Moyne was a top British official in the Middle East, overlooking everything from Egypt in the east to Persia, modern-day Iran, in the west. I got that mixed up. Egypt in the west, all the way to Persia, that is modern-day Iran, in the east. He was a top British official, basically, in the Middle East. And Lehi focused on Moyne because they believed he was the voice for Britain in the region, and believed that by killing Moyne, that would change British policy in the Middle East. In fact, they believed that that would try to push the British out of the Middle East. And so around 1:30 p.m. on 6 November 1944. 2 Lehi assassins laid in wait for the return of Lord Moyne to his home in Cairo. And as Moyne returned home, the Lehi assassins jumped out. They shot Moyne's driver before shooting Lord Moyne himself 3 times in the chest. As their choice of getaway vehicles, the 2 assassins hopped on their bicycles, and the assassins were noted by local Egyptian authorities and were chased down. The only reason why they were captured was because the 2 assassins basically pledged to only attack any British involved in the situation, in the assassination, which is why they attacked Moyne's driver, who was British. And they pledged to avoid any local Egyptian casualties. At this point, they wanted to keep the Arabs kind of on side. Lord Moyne would die 7 hours later at 8:40 p.m. on the 6th of November. In the aftermath of the assassination, Lehi would issue a statement. The statement says, quote, "We accuse Lord Moyne and the government he represents with murdering hundreds and thousands of our brethren. We accuse him of seizing our country and looting our possessions. We were forced to do justice and to fight." So in this statement, they're not saying we did this for malicious reasons. They're saying we did this because the British forced us to do this. In other words, Moyne's assassination was a version of propaganda by the deed. Lord Moyne's assassination was designed to try to bring light to the nationalist aspirations of the Jewish people, to try to bring to the forefront the nationalism of the Jewish people in British Palestine. And to do this, it was decided that Moyne must die. And on the right, we have Moyne's national, basically the national mourning of Lord Moyne. He's being ushered to lie in state. The second assassination I want to talk about is this gentleman right here, seen on the left, and in uniform, talking to a number of Boy Scouts. He was a Boy Scout leader. The assassination of Folk Bernadette. He was a Count of Wisborg, Wisborg, and he was killed on the 17th of September, 1948. Now, Bernadotte was a Swedish diplomat. Now, you might be going, gee, Mark, why is a Jewish terrorist organization attacking the Swedes? What have the Swedes done to the Jewish people? Well, Bernadotte was a Swedish diplomat appointed by the United Nations to mediate the Arab-Jewish partition in 1948. Whoop. Now, many leaders in the early Israeli state, as well as the World Zionist movement, viewed the Mandate of Palestine as one solid entity. So the proposed partition of Palestine into Arab and Israeli Jewish territory was a non-starter. No, the early Israeli and Jewish leaders basically said, Palestine, Israel is one solid state. Palestine equals Israel, regardless about who lives there. It's going to be a Jewish state. And so this led leaders of Lehi to target Bernadotte as lead mediator for assassination to ensure that Palestine would be and would remain a Jewish state. Because the Lehi leadership believed by killing someone who's perceived to be closer to the partition clan. The hope was to push like-minded officials away. And I feel like I'm doing a Drake there. Push like-minded folks away from supporting the partition plan and engendering the push towards Palestine as a Jewish state. And so a 4-member Lehi team ambushed Bernadotte's motorcade as it made its way through Jerusalem. Similar to the attack on Lord Moyne, Bernadotte and his French compatriot were shot and killed in the attack, while the non-Europeans were not targeted. After shooting Bernadotte, the Lehi team shot out the radiator, shot out the tires of the motorcade while fighting off the security detail. Folk Bernadotte, shot through the heart, died on the scene. In the aftermath of the assassination, the Israeli government disarmed the remnants of Lehi, with its remaining structure being amalgamated into the Israeli Defense Force. Now, those involved with the assassination were never really tracked down in the immediate Israeli investigation, but then again, they never really investigated all that much or all that wholeheartedly. So what we have with the creation of the Israeli state in 1948 is basically an amalgamation of Haganah, Irgun, and Lehi into the Israeli military establishment. So these organizations, the self-defense organization of Haganah, the terrorist organizations of Irgun and Lehi, become part and parcel of the Israeli defense establishment. Stop sharing. Which brings us to the end of this video. So I'm going to end our discussion of Jewish terrorism here. In the next video, we are going to sort of step back in time and start looking at things from the Arab perspective, how things are going on in Palestine from the people on the ground, from the Arab perspective. All right, so I'm going to leave you guys here. Good luck, go forth, slay dragons, and I'll see you in the next video. All right, bye.